Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Daleth, Hit. Shalom, y'all. It's time to begin. Mr. Hester is sitting. Oh, thank you, brother. All right, we're in Isaiah 54. I wanted to, before we start chapter 54, I want to point out some things because we haven't really read 51, 52, and 53. But I want to point out some the structural things that are happening to indicate the acceleration that Isaiah's message is toward what we know as chapter 53. Okay, we still have in the backdrop is the Babylonian captivity. It's been a roller coaster ride up and down. You know, God says, "I love you." They say, "Well, we don't see that because we're in captivity." And God says, "Well, you're not going to be there long, but you know, you needed to be punished for a while." And now the time has come, as we have read last week, for the return home. And the prophet approaches this from several different perspectives. This is one of the interesting, you can look at it as an artistic presentation, which is what prophetic literature really is. It employs every figure of speech that one can imagine, that is familiar to, the ancient way of writing and the rhetoric of ancient days and things like that. So everything comes to bear in prophetic literature, as we label it in academia, prophetic literature. We're familiar with the parallelisms. Every verse seems like it's a repetition. One thing is stated, then it's repeated in a different figure, and that's customary in how things were written, particularly among the Jews. That's part of what we would call Hebraic poetry. The other thing that's used a lot that we've noticed is personifications are used a lot. Israel, at times, is personified as an individual, and God's talking or the prophet's talking to that. And this gets us confused because it kind of takes us by surprise. All of a sudden, you have a shift, but we don't really pause to think about it because we're just reading Isaiah, maybe on our own or in a Bible reading. But it is important to note the shifts that are going back and forth. This is one of the ways that the prophet maintains interest and curiosity. And so, as he's writing, or first proclaimed these things orally, I'm sure, it's meant to keep the people's attention. And it's also somewhat mysterious way in which Isaiah is ultimately talking about the Savior of the world. Okay? And so the fascinating thing in looking at Isaiah is how he intertwines this messianic figure that's going to come upon the scene, but it's wrapped in figures, it's in illusions, it's sort of mysterious in places that are, you begin to wonder what's he talking about. We have the advantage of 20/20 vision, and looking back, we can see it. But if you were, at the time when you were reading Isaiah without the influence of the New Testament and its interpretation, then, you would be somewhat puzzled. It's something like, I know what you're saying, but then you're saying stuff that I don't know what you're saying. Jesus did that kind of thing too. In fact, his parables were meant to hide and reveal. Those who were in the condition of a mindset of wanting to know and of faith would ask the apostles or Jesus, what do these things mean? And then Jesus would disclose it. those who had no interest, or did not take the next step, would hear the parables and they go, well, this is an interesting story, and they would walk away, and the truth of the parable would continue to be hidden even though they heard it. So ears to hear, but they do not hear, which is given as the reason for parables and why Jesus told a lot of stories. It had a dual effect. Well, the prophetic literature, Isaiah especially, has that dual effect. There's things that are revealed and there's things that are hidden. And the things that are hidden are meant to generate curiosity so people will ask, what? It's like on the day of Pentecost when you saw all of this stuff that was happening in Jerusalem, people were asking, what do these things mean? Well, that's exactly what I've been wanting you to ask. God teaches by object lesson, and it's no different in how a teacher would teach young children or a parent, their children, in that sometimes you do something and you want to raise the curiosity of the child to ask a question. And so that's a real part of how the Jewish nation, particularly the writers, the prophets, and how God chose to communicate his message. So there's a revealing and a healing, a hiding that goes on all through Isaiah. Now, it's about to come to a crescendo, okay, because we have the Israelites, the north Israel fell, went in captivity. The southern kingdom fell, went in captivity. There were always high hopes. Maybe this is the king that will turn to God, and God would preserve the land, but each one fails. And so they go into captivity, and God's purifying them of their idolatry. He's reminding them of his love and that they're going to come home. He even predicts their return as they're going into captivity. Jeremiah, 70 years. It's actually dated, the length of time that they'll be in captivity. All of this is told beforehand, so when they do return home, it's an affirmation that there's no one like God. No other deity in the minds of people can tell what's going to happen, and it happens. But me alone, that is God. So that's one of the distinguishing factors of who God is. Now, the acceleration is felt in the writing, and I think a lot of times it's becoming familiar with the literature of the Jews, okay, and how they do things. I didn't recognize this stuff when I was first reading the Bible. It was just kind of words. But when you have an acceleration, how would a writer accelerate something? Okay, how would they begin to build a momentum, toward a pivotal, lesson or theme or object? How would they build it? Well, one of the ways that it is done in the writings of Isaiah, look at chapter 51, is the words that are used, the words like seek diligently, search, terms that are requiring one to take action, okay? Now, when you come to verse 4 of 51, he says, pay attention to me. How many times have you said that to a child? I've said that to my students. Maybe I didn't say pay attention, class, but I said it another way in order to, get them on board that we're about to arrive at something important. And then, verse 9, you have this phrase where this is, it seems to be the prophet is calling upon God. And what does he say? Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. What does awake, awake mean? It's not like God was asleep, okay? but it is a rhetorical structure to indicate it's time for action. When this language is used, when God awakens, so to speak, as we've talked about before, things tremble, the cosmos takes notice. And so the talk has been given, and now the action is taken. It's like in communicating to Assyria and the Babylonians, the prophet talks about what's God going to do, and so the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the other nations says, yeah, I hear you Jews all the time. You talk about God, and they're going to do stuff, and you can imagine how the prophet sounded to the other nations. And you remember, they did preach to other nations. That was the design of Israel, by the way, was be a light to who? The nations around, to bring people back to God. But Israel turned inward, and they sinned, and so they were not fulfilling their primary role. Now, the leaders of reaching the nation were the prophets, the preachers. Go to Nineveh. You know why? Well, God loves the Ninevites, God loves all people. They're all his creation. And so he was constantly preaching. Now, we have mostly what's recorded for us in the preaching to Israel. But there are lots of places in the Bible where we have proclamation activity among the nations. So God has not left the others alone. So it's come to the point of reality. Remember, the prophetic utterance of things is communicated often in past tense. When God says something like, you are home, okay, but they're in captivity. Well, in God's mind, it's already done. When God says something, he promises something, it's sure and steadfast. And so the prophets will use what we refer to in language studies as the prophetic perfect, which is describing future events in past time, which doesn't make sense because it's future, right? But it does make sense when you understand that it's God who's talking, and it's his message that's being communicated. So he says, awake, awake, put on the strength, O arm of the Lord. What's the arm represent? The arm, particularly the right hand. The arm is power, strength. God raises his arm. It's like, Moses raised the staff, which metaphorically, the arm of God, you see, divided the Red Sea. When God's arm is raised, as we saw in God's judgment of the nations, he judged Israel, Judah, all the nations around. He said, my arm is still outstretched. In other words, his power and his judgment against sin is not yet completed. So his arm is still outstretched. That's one of the metaphors that Isaiah uses in talking about God's judgment. So now the call for God to awake, the time has come. This is the language of the immediacy of the situation. Okay. So he says, verse 11, so the ransom of the Lord will return and come with joyful shouting to Zion. We're getting to the end of the exile. They will obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing will flee forever. Awake, O Lord, awake. And time is now, is the language of building acceleration. Now look at verse 14. The exile will soon be what? Set free. Okay? Here, we're close to the end of the Babylonian captivity, and it's just right around the corner. It's near. It's like when Jesus was here preaching about the kingdom. He said the kingdom is near. It's soon. And so it's about to happen. So we're building acceleration. Look at verse 17. Arouse yourself. Rouse yourself. Arise, O Jerusalem. So it's not only Awake, O God, but awake who? Jerusalem, okay? So a word's going to be talking about the homeland that's been desolate. Now, it's going to be personified. The land's desolate, the walls are down and everything, but the prophet is going to look at this desolation, which has been sleep for a while. You know, things are have been destroyed, and for a long period of time, there's been nothing going on. But now, what's happening? Jerusalem is being aroused, the land. And so he looks at the land and everything there, and he sees in the prophetic eye the bustling of population, because it's about to happen. Okay? So, again, God says, those who have afflicted you, I'm going to afflict. Look at chapter 52, verse 1. Awake, awake. Clothe yourself in strength, O Zion. Clothe yourself in your beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city. For the uncircumcised and the unclean will no longer come into you. So here's the word to the desolation of Jerusalem, treating them, or the city, metaphorically like a person, and a call for them to awake, okay? The city needs to awake to receive, you know, the captives. And so we've got a structure that comes at this point in Isaiah because we're at the end of the captivity. And so things are building rhetorically and structurally in Isaiah to emphasize this. God reminds them, chapter 52, verse 3, you were sold for nothing, and you will be redeemed without money. For thus says the Lord God, my people went down at first into Egypt to reside there. Then the Assyrians oppressed them without cause. Now, therefore, what do I have here, declares the Lord, seeing that my people have been taken away without cause? Again, the Lord declares, those who rule over them will howl, and my name is continually blasphemed all day long. Therefore, my people shall know my name. Therefore, in that day, I am the one who is speaking. Here I am. Then he talks about how lovely are the feet who bring good news. You know, so it's parallel when the ministry of Jesus begins, and John the Baptist and Jesus' proclamation. You know, it's the time of good news. Good news. The kingdom of God is here. The same application is being done in this situation, in which the time of departure from captivity has now arrived. Good news. You're coming home. So, verse 11, depart, depart, go out from there. Touch nothing unclean. Go out of the midst of her. Purify yourselves, you who carry the vessels of the Lord. But you will not go out in haste, nor will you go as fugitives, for the Lord will be before you, and the God of Israel will be your rear guard. See the image of the captivity ending, right? So, they go home, a bunch of gladness and all this. And if that weren't enough excitement, there's a shift in the servant image in verse 13. This is where Isaiah 53 really starts, in my judgment. Okay, remember the chapters and the verses were placed there as reference points, not by inspiration, but by scholars of the text, okay, to give reference. Sometimes the division is not in a good place. We see that in the New Testament a lot of times because like if you were saying go to chapter 14 and it begins with something, oftentimes we don't look what came before. We just start in the chapter with verse 1 thinking it's a new section, right? Well, the section that I think the acceleration, the climax, starts in verse 13. Now, this beginning in 52, verse 13 through chapter 53, is the pinnacle of what I think Isaiah has been moving toward. And we've seen the servant image used for Israel, Jacob. We've even seen it used in regard to pagan king. Isaiah's been the servant. The holy seed, the faithful, are looked at as the servant. And the context has always kind of indicated that. Who is the servant? So it's not like it's unclear. What makes the confusion, of course, as we refer to multiple times, is the way the translators kind of impose interpretation by capitalizing the pronouns that go to servant and the servant itself. Now, the servant here, I think, deserves the capitalization because it's referring not to a group of people, but to a person. And so we start in verse 13. The word behold in Hebrew is what we call an interjection of attention. It is a way of the reader, if we were Semitic people, Jews, it's causing us to take note. It's the same kind of thing when Pilate said, "Behold your king." You know, the Greek word "idu" is the correlation to hene in the Old Testament, which is had a string. Sorry. In the Old Testament, which is a particle of interjection of gaining attention. And so it's interesting that we have this word here, okay, which structurally is serving as a indication of something very important that we need to take note of. So it says, "Behold, my servant will prosper. He will be high and lifted up, greatly exalted. Just as many were astonished at" who? What do you have? You, right? Do you have you? Okay. Notice this is why it's not Israel. Notice the comparison. The prophet says, "Behold," or God, "my servant," he, it's singular, it's masculine. And then he makes the parallel. Just as the nations were surprised concerning you, they will also be concerning him. So a comparison is being made. So we're not talking about Israel, the righteous seed, or anything like that. There's a comparison being made. And so there's something profound that is occurring here. God's making a shift. The prophet is showing a shift. Now, you mean there's something better on the horizon than the return from captivity to Jerusalem? This is where God answers that question. Yes. But he does it in a way that it's as if the Jews don't recognize it. And you'll notice the language of that as we reread it. He says, "Behold, my servant will prosper. He will be high and lifted up and greatly exalted. Just as many were astonished at you," the translator add "my people," at least in the New American Standard, "so his appearance was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men." Now this is parallelism. Sons of men just means a human, okay, a person. So it's a Semitic, we call it a Semitic expression. It's idiomatic in Hebrew. A son of man indicates a human being. Now, it can be technically used as a messianic title. Remember, Jesus was also a son of what? man as well as a son of God. So we see his incarnation, you see. He took on flesh, son of man, but he was God incarnate, son of God. So he says, so his appearance was marred more than any man. Now think about this in the comparison with Israel. The Jews suffered horrifically at the hands of the Babylonians and the Assyrians, right? They went in captivity. They weren't like special people in captivity. Servants, slaves, they were subject to, the kingdom, the pagan kingdom. But many were promoted, and worked in the court of the king, as we know from Daniel and others. But in all practical purposes, these people lost everything. They lost everything. The homeland. Can you imagine that being, let's say, we were conquered by a nation, and we were driven and taken away to some commune or something to be slaves and servants to the conquerors. We would have nothing to stand on, saying, this is my right. I have a deed. Would they care? No. What about my car? What? You own nothing now. Nothing is yours. And so they had nothing. Many had died. We have, release from archaeology of how cruel the Assyrians were, and the Babylonians write about it. They laid people down who were alive on the ground and rode chariots over them to kill them. And the Assyrians were really bad. They would flay people. They would just rip the skin. We have actually some ostraca or reliefs that show the process of that happening to individuals by the hands of these pagan kings. Is brutal. And so you have the image of Israel as others looked at them. They're defeated. Man, it's horrible what's happened to them. Some celebrated it, but God says, despite that, there's a person that's similar, that's actually rises above all that you suffered and all that you are. And this is what Isaiah is referring to here. He says, his appearance was marred more than any man, his form more than any sons of men. Thus he will sprinkle many nations. Kings will shut their mouths on account of him. For what had not been told them, they will see. And what they had not heard, they will understand. See the sort of ambiguity here of seeing but not seeing, hearing but not hearing, but then seeing and understanding and hearing and, comprehending what's being said. Chapter 53 is a continuation, and it looks as if the captives, the faithful Israel, the captivity people, are asking the question here. Okay, maybe it's Isaiah rhetorically doing it, but the interesting thing is who's speaking here. Notice, who has believed our message? See the "our" there? Who has believed our message? So who's speaking? The prophet representing Israel? Is it from the standpoint of the captives who are returning home? Notice, he's made a comparison between Israel and this individual, okay? And the individual is going to be lifted up to be focused on. And verse 1 says, who would have believed the message? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Okay? For he grew up. We're still talking about the he here, this individual. He grew up before him like a tender shoot, which is sort of a bringing an image that earlier was talked about in Isaiah 11, verse 1, shoot out of parched ground. In the original application, I think it had to do with Hezekiah, but In the ultimate application, it's alluding to this servant here, in which his life, what happens to him, his activity, is going to be described here in this chapter. So he grew up, a root out of parched ground. He has no, and translators add stately form or majesty. The reason they add stately here in the New American Standard is because of the majesty. The different translations will read just slightly different because of the insertion of certain things. Now, in my translation, that which is in italics is not in the original text. It's implied, usually, by the context, but the translators are adding that in order for it to, read in English correctly. He has no stately form or majesty, that we should look upon him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief. Now, think of Israel, they were despised. They've been acquainted with grief and all these things. But this is not Israel. You see, he's already made that point in chapter 52, verse 13. The servant being talked about here is not Israel, not his people, somebody else. And he says, he was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, and like one from whom men hide their face. He was despised, and we, see the we there? Who's the we? Who? The Jews, the ones that have returned. We. Representing the Jews. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. And so it's interesting that the reader would begin asking the question, well, who is the he that these Jews now are talking about? So, notice all that is stated about this individual. I always think it's funny when we have a Jesus movie come out, or something. They get one that's, for a man to say that, but handsome, that's one that's appealing. They always have an actor that is the, what one would say is, a fair representation of a man that would be, nice and all that. Yeah.
Elizabeth could attest to this. In my classes, I will often refer to the actors who, like you're talking about, who have played Jesus. I have like a 15-minute monologue that I go through and describe in detail all these guys.
Is that true? Okay. But, that's interesting, isn't it? That's Hollywood. But from the context, it says, if you would have passed Jesus on the sidewalk, you know what?
Average-looking guy.
You would not stop. Oh, my. So, one of the, even the name Jesus given to him, such a common name like Smith, not to, demean anybody named Smith, but it's a common name. And so this Messiah, this servant that's being highlighted here, you can imagine the Jewish rabbis and teachers talking about this. One of the main reasons that Jesus was never seen as the Messiah is that he was too ordinary. What did you know about his heritage? People ask about his family. What's your dad? King? Carpenter. your mother, nobody knows her. Where are you from? Nazareth? Where is that? I've been living in Judah for so many years. I don't even know where Nazareth is. That's how small it was, okay? Insignificant. And so it was curious when Jesus starts asserting himself in his ministry, why the elitist and the Jewish, messianic hopefuls took offense. Because you cannot be what you're implying. That's why they wanted to kill him. He did not have the status, the reputation, the lineage per se, from their perspective. Yes.
During the intertestamental period, there's one description of one of the Maccabean descendants who's paraded through Rome as one of the conquered kings, and the person writing about it says that he's just distinguished from all the rest of them because of his regal bearing.
Yeah.
Which is, he looks like a king, which is so different, like you're talking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah. Yeah. And there were many that even Acts talks about arose calling themselves the Messiah, that tried to assert themselves. But Jesus was very ordinary in his human appearance. Yeah. Well, one of the reasons that they recognized the difference in his speaking is that he didn't footnote anything. In other words, when the rabbis and others argued their positions and spoke, they would say something, and they would say, as Rabbi Hillel said, as Rabbi so-and-so, as Rabbi so-and-so, as Rabbi so-and-so. So it was a matter of getting your brotherhood speakers behind you, So that kind of thing still happens a lot today. So one of the reasons Jesus is seen to be different is that he didn't do that. He said, I say unto you. He spoke as if by his own authority. That was a no-no. Okay. I don't know, when you read the parables and stuff like that, I would assume that he had a normal voice. I don't, we can just speculate. But I think the thing that distinguished him is that he was so unlike any other Jewish speaker. Who would rattle on and on about those who supported his view. So, very ordinary, but extraordinary, for sure. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. So from the perspective of the Jews, he went without recognition. We totally messed up. God is indicating, the prophet is indicating, before it actually happens, okay, that they missed it. The Jews missed it. They didn't see it coming. They didn't see all that's been taking place with them as being parallel to that which ultimately will achieve God's purpose. For they didn't achieve God's purpose of reaching the world. They weren't achieving God's purpose of keeping the law. Now, they forsook idolatry, but when Jesus comes upon the scene, he argues with all the Pharisees and everybody. They went from idols to tradition. In view of, I guess, in changing their ways, they began to stress other things. But they weren't pagan people anymore, which was good. But they weren't people to be exemplar for the nations and to atone ultimately for the sins of humanity. So look at verse 4. Surely our griefs he himself bore. Now the word himself, at least in verse 10 we have it also, rendered himself, is actually from the Hebrew word nephesh, which means soul, which is describing his very being. He offered himself, his whole self. And our sorrows he carried. See the introduction of the substitutionary nature of this servant who takes upon himself the sorrows, the sins, the griefs of others. He says, yet we, okay, here's the we again, we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. In other words, from the Jewish standpoint and what happened or what's going to happen to this servant, they just wrote him off, particularly when he went to the cross. Because that would not be what God's servant would be found on. He would be found maybe in a chariot, a royal chariot, coming in just like Absalom used to drive. You remember his chariot, his runners he would have with him. Can you imagine being a runner with Absalom's chariot and stirring up all the dust? But everybody was impressed with that. That's Absalom, see. Jesus walks by, no one sees him. So they totally missed it, totally dropped the ball. Have you ever done that? Just missed it, whatever it was. Never recognized it. Matthew 8, verse 14 is interesting because we have this quoted in the Gospel of Mark. I'm sorry, Matthew. I said Matthew, didn't I? Okay. This is Peter's mother-in-law and others who were healed. Verse 14, when Jesus came into Peter's home, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and waited on him. When evening came, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were ill. This was to fulfill what was spoken through him by Isaiah the prophet. He himself took our iniquities and carried away our diseases, is how we have it. Here we have, but he was pierced through, we say, surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried. Okay. So from the standpoint of this particular thing, the healings that Jesus did are nothing but anticipatory of what would happen on the cross. What's Jesus doing in the symbolism of the healings? He's taking them away. And ultimately, in regard to sin, he's going to bear or be the one to bear the iniquity or the judgment of sin. And so even his healings are representative of the griefs being taken away, the transgressions being taken away. The whole ministry of Jesus is that of substitutionary, action and behavior. So, our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried, yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, afflicted. But he was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Anybody have bruised? There's some controversy about this word. I think most have bruised. Who has bruised? Okay, what version is that? King James. New American Standard has crushed. He was crushed for our iniquities. the chastening for our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging, we are healed. Now, do you see the contrast of how this is messianic from the standpoint of how it's being presented? No other servant has been identified this way, but this servant who does the will of God is one who suffers and serves as a substitution for what others should get. Okay, I guess I ought to stop there. We'll stop there and we'll finish it